What famous moment in history is greatly misconstrued by many? Not many people panicked after War of the Worlds was aired in 1938. There were isolated reports of incidents from some of the very small number of viewers. Newspapers exaggerated the incidents to discredit radio advertising. Paul Revere did not make his famous "The British Are Coming" ride alone. He was joined by two other men, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott. And Connor Kenway. Does short-term history count? Hurricane Katrina is credited with hitting New Orleans and causing the levers to fail. While it did, it's not the whole story. Actually, the eye came ashore near Boris Triumph in Venice, LA at 27.2 inches Hg/110 kT upper Cat 3, and a game near Waveland and Bay St. Louis, Mis at a slightly weakened strength. New Orleans was outside of the eye and partially under the western eye wall, where the wind and surge wasn't remotely as high as on the eastern eye wall. If the levers had been up to code, New Orleans would have been spared. For a city under sea level, they have been spared way too many times to count. 1. That Ben Franklin discovered electricity. He proved that it was in nature. His kite was never even struck by lightning. He noticed the fibers on the string standing up and touched the key and felt the accumulated electricity from the air. Some guy's kite was hit and he died. 2. Marie Antoinette said let them eat cake. At the time she allegedly said it, she was only 11 years old and couldn't have said it. When the line was quoted, it was only said to have been from a great princess. The great princess may have been Marie Therese. 3. In the Salem witch trials, witches were burned at the stake. Hanging was actually the preferred method of execution, but one victim was crushed under heavy stones. The townspeople may have also been suffering from mass hysteria or had eaten tainted rye bread and hallucinated. 4. Cinderella wore glass slippers to the ball. In the early French version she wore slippers made of white squirrel fur, or in French pantoufles en verre. When the story was told later, the word verre had disappeared from the French language but was pronounced the same way as the word verre, which meant glass. It was then passed down since. I know the last one isn't quite related but still interesting. I heard that the prince went around trying on the fur slippers of all the ladies in the land before finding one that fit just right. Hey, what an appropriate day to ask this question, since it's the 103rd anniversary of the sinking of the RMS Titanic. Anyways, much of the heroism and villainy associated with this famous maritime disaster is bulls. Gates separating steerage from the upper classes weren't used to keep them locked in during the disaster. Contrary to what James Cameron would like you to believe, they were there for compliance with immigration law. White Star Line's Bruce Ismay was not some dirty coward who dressed up like women or used his position to bully past women and children for the lifeboats. A lot of the boats were being sent off half full, and when all the nearby women children had their chance, he just took his seat. Nothing uniquely cowardly there. Captain E.J. Smith was not particularly courageous just because he stayed behind with his ship. In fact, many accounts suggest he had a breakdown of sorts, since this was his final voyage before retirement. And of what we do know, we're well aware that he prioritized getting to New York in record time over the ice warnings on his path. Rather than Captain Swansong, it was the run-of-the-mill seamen and wireless officers, Jack Phillips, Harold Bride, who stepped up to the plate. Minor issue, Molly Brown was a hero, but not because she fought with some lifeboat rower over whether or not to go back for survivors. More on that later. She was a hero because she kept a calm head in a pretty tragic situation, helped convince people to get on lifeboats, raised people's spirits, and took a row herself. I'm glad the 1997 movie highlights her, but not so glad they made a big deal out of this one exchange. Guys like Robert Hitchens, the dude who supposedly fought with Molly Brown, aren't villains for refusing to go back immediately for survivors. While his fears about the suction may have been exaggerated, or possibly even a lie to shut up survivors, there is a serious survival instinct going on with all those people in the water. And while it's by no means a pretty thing to say, you can't exactly call Hitchens a bad guy for doing what he thought was best to protect the lives in his care. Definitely have to agree with the last point. A dozen panicked people trying to claw their way into a lifeboat from the water could pretty easily capsize it. Catherine the Great didn't frick a horse. Nero didn't fiddle as Rome burned. The fiddle hadn't been invented yet and he actually overhauled the fighting system. It's amazing what your political enemies will come up with once you're dead. that World War I wouldn't have happened if Franz Ferdinand wasn't assassinated. Europe was a powder keg in 1914. If it wasn't that, it would have been something else. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. The Confederate States thought themselves to be a separate nation, had no reason to follow the USA laws. Lincoln did not apply the proclamation to the border states. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The proclamation enables Lincoln to keep the South from getting foreign aid and gave the US a reason to allow runaway slaves to join the Northern Army. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just about no taxation without representation. Many of the people involved were actually tea smugglers, and the new law effectively reduced the tax on tea, allowing the East India Company to undercut the smugglers' prices. It also gave a monopoly on tea sales to people friendly to the crown. Well, you all drink coffee now anyway. Don't see what all the fuss was about. Sips his Earl Grey, slowly nodding. The Mongols weren't entirely barbarians. Sure, they slaughtered a pretty hefty sum of people and owned the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen, but they did some cool things. They restored granaries and lowered peasant taxes in China, which helped win the favor of the peasants. They also reopened China to trade. The empire in general was very religiously tolerant, and the capital, Karakoram, had places of worship for several different religions. Also, they created a Mongolian language. This was for scholars to learn, so they could interact with other scholars that didn't have a common language. Speaking of scholars, the best scholars in the entire empire were often summoned to Karakoram to collaborate and innovate. Thanks to the Mongolian language, Chinese and Muslim scholars could cooperate. Michael Jordan was never cut from his high school basketball team. When he was a sophomore, he was placed on the JV team instead of the varsity team. The varsity team was full of seniors who weren't allowed to play on the JV team, and the final spot was between Jordan and a forward. There were plenty of guards already on the varsity, so the team was in need of a forward. The coach gave the final spot to the forward and Jordan was placed on the JV team. Now, everyone thinks Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team as a sophomore. The American War of Independence. It wasn't a very significant war for Britain. The empire continued growing. At its height in the Victorian era, the loss of India and others in the 20th century had a far greater on the British psyche. Paul Revere never said the British are coming as he was British. Instead, he said, the regulars are coming, referencing the regular British army. The actual quote was, "Regulators, mount up." The most common one I used to hear all the time was that Columbus discovered the world was round. Pretty much everything Columbus related was twisted. Now that I think about it, they said that he discovered America. They said that people believed he'd fall off the side of the earth. And they said he was a compassionate, altruistic hero. Turns out they were wrong about all of that. My dad once beat the crap out of me with a set of jumper cables because I arrived late to a family barbecue on Columbus Day, saying that I had disrespected one of the greatest heroes of all time. But today the notion of Columbus is beginning to change. In fact, the older I get, the more I realize that most supposed heroes have huge hidden blemishes. Elvis used to sleep with 14-year-old girls. When I told my dad about that, he flipped out and beat the crap out of me with a set of jumper cables. I think people deep down want to keep these blemishes hidden because they like to preserve the fantasy. You again. The pilgrims didn't leave England to escape prosecution. No one was hunting them. They left because they thought the English state church wasn't strict enough and wanted to live somewhere where they could set the rules and live amongst other Puritans. Most Americans make it seem like they were all fleeing from some terrible fate back home, while in fact they were the judgmental douches. Pilgrims. Einstein didn't really fail math. For all you math failers who looked up to Einstein's story as inspiration, sorry to crash all your dreams. The sinking of the Lusitania is what made the US declare war against the Axis in World War I. The US did not join the war until 2 years after the Lusitania was sunk. We were always taught that the Lusitania and Zimmerman note swayed public opinion from isolationism to being pro-war. Neither event got the US involved directly. The storming of the Bastille is often seen as this triumphant moment in French history, but it really wasn't. The mob forming outside sent in a delegate to talk to the people inside. There were about 10 because it was almost fully decommissioned as a prison. While the delegate was eating lunch with the guards, people outside began to wonder what was taking so long and came to the conclusion that their delegate was killed or captured. So the mob ran in and killed the 10 people working there for no goddamned reason. Columbus wasn't the first to land in America. Leif Erikson touched down on Newfoundland, but didn't reach the mainland. Columbus didn't really reach the mainland, he landed in the Bahamas. Also, I see more people saying that this is a myth than I see people talking about it as if it were true. Nero most likely was not fiddling while Rome burned. There is enough evidence to support that he actually acted very quickly to deal with the current effects of the fire. If he somehow did fiddle while staring at his burning city of marble, he probably did so because he was very artistic, to the disappointment of every patrician, and may have thought that it was his moment to shine. He would have used a lyre, not a violin, since violins didn't exist. The War of 1812 was more of a draw than a victory for either side. Everything basically stayed how it was prior to the war. But you can say that the First Nations tribes lost the most. Not really a moment, but most people still don't realize it. At a party once, George Washington held an opponent's wife's hand, in acid. He also had 4 balls, and like 30 dongs. Sometimes he enjoyed having sex with bears, as well. Really interesting guy. Not only did Chris Columbus not discover the New World, it's often overlooked that he introduced racial slavery to the Americas, oversaw the genocide of the native tribe he encountered, and sold their youngest children into sexual slavery back in Europe. When he first saw Native Americans, his impression of them was that they would make great slaves, believing, before even meeting them, that they would be inferior to white people, and this guy has a federal holiday named for him. That the Constitution of the United States was the first and only government of the US. There was a whole other type of government based on a loose confederacy of states for a couple of years in between the end of the Revolutionary War and the signing of the Constitution. That the 3-5s compromise was some sort of attempt to denigrate black people as 3-5s of a person. The actual intent was to prevent the slave states from dominating Congress. Slaves couldn't vote, but they were counted for the purposes of allocating seats in Congress. This gave extra seats and voting power to the white Southerners who could vote, so the count of slaves was reduced by 40% to lower Southern congressional representation. This actually gave more power to the free states. Most Russians believe that World War II started in June of 1941. The reason it was and is taught like that is because Russia actually supported Germany up to that moment, and it is kinda unpatriotic to admit that you split a foreign country with the Nazis like a dessert. The death of Alexander the Great, though really just Alexander in general. He wasn't some proto-liberal philosopher king on the cusp of creating an enlightened empire. He was an adventurer, warlord, and very much a product of his time. It's easy to see why the legend formed. He's a talented general, generous in victory. He died very young, though not exactly in his prime. Plus he was at one point tutored by Aristotle, but the reality was that he cared very little for state building, and almost everything he did was in pursuit of glory and living out a violent fairy tale where he was the hero. I think that he lived longer, history would have remembered him very differently. Towards the end of his reign he was capricious, paranoid, and often drunk. Historians haven't thought this for decades, but I still see the Alexander as visionary narrative show up in pop culture once in a while. That Einstein failed high school math. He didn't. He failed one entrance exam to a college but always excelled at math. Dedicated to every moron who thinks that he is the next Einstein after failing maths. A lot of people seem to remember the 3-5 compromise as racist under the premise that every black person's vote counted as 0.6 votes. However, this compromise was demanded by the North because if every slave was represented as one person, the southern states would earn many more members of Congress and thus have an advantage in legislation. If the South had an advantage in legislation, they would be working towards keeping slavery legal. Therefore, the 3-5 compromise more or less was less harmful than most people think. It wasn't harmful, it was a good thing. Having slaves considered full people when determining representatives was just giving their owners more power, which didn't represent slaves or help them in any way. That the British and French could have stopped Hitler in his tracks by resisting the German remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936. The German army planned to withdraw out of the Rhineland if they sensed resistance from British or French forces. No such resistance occurred, which led to bolder German actions in 1938 and onward. Had the Brits and French sent troops into the Rhineland to uphold the demilitarization imposed by Versailles, Hitler may have thought twice about invading Czechoslovakia and or Poland. That the British and French could have stopped Hitler in his tracks. Hitler may have thought twice about invading Czechoslovakia and or Poland. These aren't really the same thing at all. You start with an affirmative statement and end with a very unsure maybe. Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. Literally none of that sentence is true. 1. His name was Cristobal Colon. 2. We have definite proof of Nordic discovery of America several centuries earlier, if you establish discoverers post-rise of Golden Age civilization. Otherwise it would just be who crossed over from Asia first. 3. It was not exactly 1492 because the Gregorian calendar had not been created yet, and if you use a proleptic you encounter problems. All of that is true. However, I would still consider it fair to claim that he discovered it from his viewpoint. Most of the people in Europe were not aware of America's existence at that time. He was certainly not the first one to discover it, but that doesn't mean that he can't have discovered it as well. The Catholic Church never disagreed with Galileo's discoveries of his sun-centered model of the universe. Scholars in the church had already known about this, along with several other scientists, for ages by the time of Galileo's publication. The only reason they condemned Galileo was because of tradition. Even though higher-ups in the Catholic Church knew it wasn't the case, they still taught the classic Aristotelian model of the universe because it had been done so for centuries and they didn't want to change the church's teachings. The Armenian Genocide, where 1.5 Armenian perished in the first systematic genocide of the 20th century. Turkey still adamantly denies this to be the case. 100 years on, luckily, many historians, states and countries have accepted it as historical fact. There was no big signing of the Declaration of Independence. People just sorta signed it over the course of a few weeks when they happened to be in town. People usually believe it was some big convention that everyone attended at once. Remember the Alamo? American immigrants that were in Mexican territory decided they wanted to be part of America because of Mexico's denial of individual rights. Dog whistle for slaveholding. I really wish people would actually include sources with their posts to back up their assertions. I know this isn't Ask Historians, but history is a field where content can easily be distorted and politicized to a point where we accept them as fact. That and the novelty accounts are really pushing me over the edge every time a history thread comes up. The pyramids were not built with the blood of Hebrew slaves. In fact, there is no redeemable evidence that the Israelites were ever enslaved by the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians built those architectural masterpieces all by themselves. Napoleon's ceremony for becoming emperor. Dude just crowned himself. In the painting they make a giant scene that occurred quite differently. Not a moment, but a lot of kids' stories will tell you that George Washington never told a lie. In reality, if he hadn't had a complex network of spies in the British Army that he did, America wouldn't be a thing. I, too, enjoy turn. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves. It only freed the slaves in states that had seceded, not in any of the Union states or border states. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.